Okay, I'll be reading from 2 Corinthians and start in chapter 6, 1 and 2, then turn over to 7, 1 through 4. And it begins on page 1799 in your pew Bibles. As God's fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain, for he says, "In the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you." I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. Since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you. I have great confidence in you. I take great pride in you. I am greatly encouraged. In all our troubles, my joy knows no bounds.
Grace. It's a word that we use in our culture to mean anything from the prayer you say before a meal to the smooth and fluid movements of an Olympic ice skater, or to the mansion where Elvis Presley lived. Basically, grace is thought to be something that you either have or you don't have. If you saw me on roller skates or ice skates or skis, you would say, I don't have it. But biblically speaking, we need to understand grace not as something that we have or don't have, but as something that we give and receive. That's what the word really means. The Greek word for grace is charis, which actually is the same word for the word for gift. Grace is a gift. A gift is something that you receive or give. Well, God's grace is a gift. When we say that we are saved by grace, that means that we didn't earn our salvation. We didn't achieve it. We didn't buy it. It was given to us. God gives us His favor, His approval, even though it's unmerited. All we have to do is to receive the gift. That's what faith is, just receiving the gift that God's offered to us. And then when we have received that gift, grace then becomes something that we can give as well. We can bestow favor on others, even if they don't deserve it, because of the fact that God has given us this gift of grace. A long time ago, there was a book called I'm Okay, You're Okay. It's a very popular book, I think back in the 70s. Maybe you heard about it, you remember that. And it talked about the need for acceptance of ourselves and of others. And that was the healthy thing to say, I'm okay, you're okay, instead of the different options. There's a graph up there, I think, that talks about the different ways you could look at it. You could say, instead of I'm okay, you're okay, you could say, I'm okay, but you're not okay. Or I'm not okay and you are okay. Or I'm not okay and you're not okay. But instead, the goal of that book was to be able to say, I'm okay and you're okay. Acceptance of ourselves and of others. Very noble and worthy concept. Except for the fact that it's impossible to do, not without the grace of God. Because without grace, I can't say I'm okay, because I'm not. I can deceive myself into having a great opinion of myself, but I'd be wrong because I have a sinful nature which needs to be redeemed, and it can only be redeemed by God's grace. And without grace, I can't say about others that you're okay, because I'd be wrong about that too. You have the same sinful nature that I do, and you're not okay, unless I have some kind of inferiority complex and just think everybody's better than me, or I have a warped view of humanity where I think that everybody's just basically good at heart. I cannot blindly accept others until I have first received God's grace, and then I have learned how to give it away to others. Many Christians, however, who have trusted Christ to save them and who love to sing Amazing Grace that saved a wretch like me, have not learned how to give grace as well as receive it. And you might say, well, only God can do that. Only God can bestow favor on someone. That's not for us to do. But I think that's wrong. I think that receiving God's grace means that we can genuinely extend that same grace to others. And if we don't, then we have, as Paul said in chapter 6, verse 1 that Dave read for us, we've received God's grace in vain. And verse 2 goes on to say, In the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. And then for the next 3 chapters, Paul goes on to describe how Christians are to treat each other and to give to one another. And so, what I'm saying here is that if you have really experienced God's grace in your own life, it can't help but to make a difference in the way that you not only treat others, but in your entire attitude that you have about other people. So many of our attitudes are totally graceless. Now, by the word graceless, I know you're picturing me on ice skates again. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way that we choose to live and to treat others so often without grace. One thing that we do when we live without grace is to make comparisons. Paul had to deal with this constantly. He was always being compared to somebody else, and his ministry was always being evaluated in comparison to something else. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul talked about how the church was comparing one leader to another, one ministry to another, and they were attaching loyalties based on these comparisons. One group would say, I follow Paul, and another group would say, I follow Apollos, and others compared him to Peter, while some who really wanted to make themselves look more spiritual than everybody else would say, well, I just follow Christ, which sounds really good, but all they were doing was just trying to put down the other guys. In verses 3 and 4 of 2 Corinthians 6, Paul indicates how hard he worked to remain credible in the face of all these different comparisons. He didn't want anything about his ministry to be a stumbling block to all those who were making comparisons. He says, we put no stumbling block in anyone's path, so that our ministry will not be discredited. Rather, as servants of God, we commend ourselves in every way, in great endurance, in troubles, hardships, and distresses. And he goes on to name all the different distresses that he had to endure. But see, if the church had only learned how to give grace and not just receive it, he shouldn't have had to do all of that defending of himself. Because it's no fun to be compared to other people, is it? None of us likes it when it's done to us. Do you like your parents to compare you to your brothers and sisters? Do you like your spouse to compare you to a former boyfriend or girlfriend? Do you like your boss to compare you to who had your job before you did? It just doesn't work out. If it's a negative comparison, then it really hurts. But even if it's a positive comparison, wouldn't you rather be valued just for who you are than rather how you stack up compared to somebody else? But yet this is what we do to one another so often. Even if we don't voice our opinions to the people that we're comparing, those graceless attitudes come through loud and clear through so many of our sniping comments. Oh, last year's homecoming queen was prettier, don't you think? Johnny doesn't do as well in school as his brother Billy did. Oh, this isn't how my mother cooked fried chicken. Our new neighbors aren't as friendly as the ones who moved away. I'd rather stay home and watch Charles Stanley on television than come to church to hear our preacher. That one really hurts. But one of the most graceful things that you can do, a gift that you can give to another person, is to not compare him or her to someone else. It takes grace to be able to do that. It doesn't come naturally, but God gave you His grace. Why don't you give it to others by not making comparisons? Another thing we do when we live without grace is to attach labels. We like to put people into boxes, marked with our neat little categories, and we like to keep them there. Sometimes the categories might be accurate, sometimes they're totally wrong, but the thing is, once those categories are established, then those labels tend to be rather permanent. Paul remarks in verses 8 through 10 of 2 Corinthians 6 how he was labeled a certain way even though the opposite was actually true. It says, genuine yet regarded as impostors, known yet regarded as unknown, dying and yet we live on, beaten and yet not killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing, poor yet making many rich, having nothing yet possessing everything. I think the thing is, if we can attach a label to somebody, then that makes us feel better about ourselves. All of our labels that we put on people are truly relative to ourselves. If we want to be included with a certain group or associated with a certain person, then we give them a label that we like. And if we want to distance ourselves from a group or a person, then we attach to them a label that we don't like. And those labels may be totally accurate, but they're still always in relation to ourselves. And I confess, I do this too myself. And if someone is more liberal theologically than I am, then he's liberal. If someone is more conservative than I am, since I consider myself to be quite conservative, well, then he is ultra-conservative. And while those labels may be accurate or they may not, I've just put people into my own little box with no intentions of letting them out. And that's graceless. It's selfish. And we all do it. With one word we can label individuals, and we can exalt our opinion of ourselves. Teenagers, they're just wild. Older people are stuck in their ways. People who disagree with us are stubborn. People who are wealthier than us are arrogant. People who are poorer than us are unmotivated. And yes, sometimes we even do it in church. People less involved in church than we are uncommitted. People who are more involved are legalistic. People who might be more reserved in the way that they worship are stuffy. People who are less reserved are fanatics. And the list could go on and on. This is to live without grace. Whenever we attach labels to people, we determine how we are going to view them from that point forward. And that's not fair. It isn't right. And it means that we've received God's grace in vain. Another thing that we do when we live without grace is to place expectations. The Corinthians placed expectations on Paul, and when he fell short of those expectations, the people did what people do when expectations are not met. Verse 11 of 2 Corinthians 6 says, "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us." Now, isn't that what people often do when somebody isn't meeting your expectations? Don't you start holding back your attention or your affection until they start doing better? Do you stop giving gifts and showing support to let them know that they're not measuring up? Pretty normal thing to do, a natural thing to do, but it's sure far removed from this whole concept of grace. Now, I'm not talking about stated expectations. We should expect people to do what they said they were going to do. Your employer has a right to expect you to fulfill your job description. If you take on a job at church, we expect you to take it seriously. If you make a promise to somebody, then there is an expectation to be met. God has expectations of you. He expects you to obey His commandments. But I'm talking more about those unstated expectations. When you start to expect others to treat you a certain way or to do certain things for you, simply because if they were real friends, they would, or if they were real Christians, then you think they would, when no promises were made, no expectations were stated, you just expect it. That's living without grace. Don't do that to people. If you have expectations of others that have never been stated, then stop having the expectations. Or at least state the expectations and see if they are understood and agreed upon. Now, the best of relationships are the ones with the fewest expectations, isn't that right? Because those relationships are based on grace and not performance. Think of your best friendships. Aren't they the ones where you're just free to be yourself and you give when you are able and because you love and not because it's expected of you? Despite the graceless way that the Corinthians treated Paul, he showed them what it was like to live with grace. And in him, we see the difference between the graceless attitudes of comparisons and labels and expectations and the Christ-like attitude of pure and simple grace. First of all, when you live with grace, sin becomes the enemy and not people. Even though Paul was opposed at every corner, often even by fellow Christians, Paul kept coming back. He kept writing and instructing and teaching and preaching, even though often none of it seemed to be sinking in, and people kept opposing him. Why did he do that? How could he do that? Well, because he did not regard people as his enemy, but rather the sins that they were committing. In chapter 7, verse 1, Paul writes, "Since we have these promises, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God." See, grace is not some wimpy, cowardly attitude that overlooks or excuses sin just so that you can get along with people. That's what a lot of people think about grace. Rather, grace is the courage to look beyond the sin and to love people in spite of their sin. It's loving them enough to work at overcoming the sin and teaching them to live pure and clean lives. And that is exactly what the gift of God's grace has done for us. And that's the gift that we can give to others. When sin is our enemy and not people, then there's nothing that people can do to hurt us. Oh, we'll still get hurt, and we'll get hurt often. But it's not the people who are hurting us, but it's the sin. So go ahead and be angry at the sin. Call it what it is. But love the people enough to believe that they can overcome the sin. That's what Jesus did for us at the cross. Would he have taken our punishment if he had no hope that we could be born again and live new lives? What would have been the point of that? In his grace, he saw beyond our sin, and he loved us. At the cross, sin and death and hell were conquered forever. Jesus didn't die just to conquer those hypocritical Pharisees, or to defeat those bloodthirsty multitudes, or to show up those sniveling government leaders, or those conniving religious leaders. No, he died to conquer sin. And even though all those labels of people were accurate, God looked beyond that, and he gave Jesus as his gift of grace. Will you have the courage to extend the same gift to others, though on a much smaller scale, of course? You may not have to lay down your life for somebody else, but you will probably have to suffer a little bit because of somebody else's sin. There's going to be some way you're going to suffer because of what somebody else did that was wrong. It's very easy to become angry then at the person who sinned, that you make that person your enemy. But giving grace means that it is not the person who becomes your enemy, but rather his sin. And I'm not saying that you're going to be bosom buddies with someone who has deeply hurt you, but I am saying that there will be a day when God's going to call you to pull out those Christ-like qualities of forgiveness and compassion and kindness. And if you've already determined that someone is your enemy, you're not going to be able to do that. But if the sin is the enemy and not the person, then you will be able to obey that call, and grace will have made you the victor once again. Secondly, when you live with grace, you give people space. That could be our catchphrase for the day. If you remember anything from the sermon, you can go home and talk about lunch, what the preacher talked about. You can remember that. When you live with grace, you give people space. Paul said the same thing a little bit differently in verse 2 of chapter 7. It says, "Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you. I have great confidence in you. I take great pride in you. I am greatly encouraged. In all our troubles, my joy knows no bounds." Paul says, we've made room in our hearts for you. Will you make room in your hearts for us? When you understand God's grace and what he has done for you in Christ, then you are able to give other people a little bit of space. I don't mean excusing their sin, but I do mean giving them room enough to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes, allowing others the space to grow. And if you do that, if you give others a little space, that actually solves all these other problems that we talked about living without grace. You won't be comparing them to others because there is space in between them and others. You won't be attaching labels because there is space for them to change and to grow out of those set categories that we might put people in. If you give those wild teenagers a little space, then, they're going to settle down sooner or later. If you give those older people a little space to be stuck in their way, sooner or later they'll come around. If you give the immature Christian a little room to make mistakes, then they're able to grow. If you give the inexperienced leader a little chance to experiment and to develop skills, then you're going to wind up with an experienced leader. But if you keep them in the box that you put them in with all your labels, then that's where they're going to stay. And you will have expectations that they will never be able to meet. And grace just goes out the window. So let's start working at giving grace as well as receiving it. Some of you might still need to learn how to receive it. You think you have to fit into some kind of mold to be a Christian and think of this label of how a Christian is supposed to act and think that even the Bible has never imposed on you. Perhaps you're frustrated with yourself. You can't forgive yourself. And you're putting on a big front to make everybody think that you've got everything together. If you haven't received grace, then there's no way that you can give it. I ask that you would receive it today. More than just acknowledging that God loves you and that Jesus died on the cross for you, receive God's grace and let him change you from within. He gives you lots of space to grow into. And those of us who know and who have received God's grace, let's work harder at giving it to others. Let's not make people our enemies, but rather fight against that which contaminates both body and spirit. Let's give each other a little room to grow and to develop. Remember, when you live with grace, you give people space. And let us thank God for the grace that He has given to us. He made sin to be His enemy, and He poured out His love for us. He just keeps giving His grace. He giveth and giveth and giveth again. As we sing that great old hymn, if there is anyone